Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Hello, hello. Oh my goodness, Jackie, it's getting closer to Christmas and there's no snow. At least we don't have any snow where we're at right now. But you know what? We have another exciting guest today on the 1950s Fun Chat. And take it away, sister.
Okay, before we begin, please notice www.wildthewindmillwatch.com. That's a very informative website where you'll find out many things about the book, While the Windmill Watched, A Slice of Rural America in the 1950s, about the vendors, about the authors, and about the 1950s Fun Chat. So we have quite a few on there now, and this, Janine, will be what number?
119.
119. So this started in the fall of 21, I believe it was, and so we have introduced you to many outstanding and interesting guests. Also, upper right-hand corner, you'll see a copy of the book, and note that two things. First of all, the cover is a beautiful North Dakota sunset that wraps around the cover, front, back, and also that little white spot on the bottom there. That indicates a very special award that the book was given by the National Independent Press, and it was given a regional nonfiction category title of Distinguished Favorite. So check that out.
Yep.
But without further ado, as they say in the business, I'd like to introduce you to Jeremy Parsons. Jeremy Parsons was born in 1977 in Leon, Iowa, a small town of less than 2,000 people. He earned a BA degree in English from Southwest Baptist University in Bolivar, Missouri, and an MA degree in education from William Woods University in Fulton, Missouri. Jeremy is also a graduate of the International Association of Fairs and Expos Institute of Fair Management and is a certified fair executive. That's quite a title. A former teacher and coach, Jeremy served as the executive director of the Missouri State Fair Foundation before being named the CEO manager of the Clay County Fair in Spencer, Iowa in 2011. With more than 30 years of fair experience, Jeremy spent his early years as a seasonal employee at the Iowa State Fair and as a volunteer at his home county fair in Leon. But in March of 2023, he was named CEO and manager of the prestigious Iowa State Fair. He and his wife, Kelsey, live in Des Moines and have 3 sons. So, Jeremy, we welcome you to the 1950s Fun Chat.
Well, it's good to be with you. You both seem like very fun people, so this will be a very fun chat for sure.
We like that.
All righty. Thank you. So we're going to begin by saying that the guests of the 1950s Fun Chat have either been born during that decade or have been influenced by that decade. How have the 1950s influenced you?
Well, that's a good question. Obviously, not not a child of the 1950s, a child of the 1970s. But when I think back to the 1950s through things I've learned and talking to my grandparents and parents, such great memories of that decade growing up for my family on small farms here in Iowa. And a lot of great memories for my family in the 1950s at even the Iowa State Fair where I am today. So a lot of, I think with everybody, the past puts you where you are. And obviously a lot of who I am is based on people who were part of the 1950s.
Okay. I like that slogan, Jeremy, that you just said. The past puts you where you are. That is so interesting, because I think the older we get, the more at least I personally reflect on the past. And I'm curious, when you said something about the special memories in the 50s of the Iowa State Fair, what do you know any special memories?
Well, I know for my family, growing up at the Iowa State Fair meant also camping at the Iowa State Fair. And so I know my mom, of course, camped here at the fair with my grandparents, and so a lot of their experiences at the Iowa State Fair as children for my parents was definitely in the 1950s for sure.
Did they go in the old mill?
Definitely. Yep. We've got an old mill here at the Iowa State Fair, been around for over 100 years, but I think many Iowans had their first smooch probably on the Iowa State Fair or at the old mill for sure at the fair.
And is that a personal story there? We don't.
No, there's no personal story there for me, but no.
All right. All right. Well, thank you. So when you were studying at the Institute of Fair Management, what topic did you find the most valuable in helping you become a certified fair executive?
Yeah, that's a great question. Fairs are such unique events and really one of the few places left in the world where entire families can come together and spend a whole day together, regardless of their generation or their interests, and find something that really interests them or intrigues them or entertains them at the fair. So, really that's what the fair is all about. And so, doing that Institute of Fair Management, really, we talk a lot about safety and security. Obviously, we want people to feel safe when they're at the fair. And so safety and security is always a big topic. Anytime you're bringing thousands of people as in a county fair situation, or for us here at the Iowa State Fair, 1.1 million people together over our 11 days.
Okay.
Jeremy,
So go ahead, Janine.
Okay. What, in thinking about the growth of the fair and how it's changed or how it even began, how did the Iowa State Fair begin?
Well, the Iowa State Fair started in 1854, appropriately in Fairfield, Iowa. And so we are rapidly approaching our 170th year of existence. But really, fairs started much like they still exist today. They started as a chance for farmers, for rural people to get together and compete. Who had the best cow, who made the best pie, who made the best jar of jam. And so that started in the 1850s, and the Iowa State Fair then kind of wandered throughout the state of Iowa until 1886, when it moved to its permanent location here, in the fairgrounds. The entire Iowa State Fairgrounds is on the National Register of Historic Places. As you see kind of behind me, I'm in our administration building, which is our office building, but it was built in 1908 and has been wonderfully restored. So really, the fair has been making family memories for almost 170 years.
Yes, no doubt. And what's happened then from when it first started, moved from Fairfield to Des Moines, and then crept up into the 1950s. Give us an overview of what the fairgrounds looked like in the 1950s.
Sure. Well, in the 1950s, a lot of the Iowa State Fairgrounds looks the same as it does today. Again, many of our historic buildings on the grounds were actually built in the 1910s, 1920s. So actually, the Iowa State Fairgrounds of the 1950s looks very similar to what it would today. And so I think that's part of that historical back to that family tradition and the history of the Iowa State Fair, that people have been looking at these buildings and doing the same things at the fair, as they have since the 1950s. Big, beautiful brick buildings here. Of course, entertainment has changed over the years, throughout time. But when you look at the fair history, obviously, like most major events, the Iowa State Fair did not happen during World War II. So when World War II ended, this huge pent-up demand for people to get out and be entertained. And of course, people were more mobile, and so more people could come to the fair. And you look at even at 1951, the fair set a record attendance for that time of nearly 600,000 people in 1951. Wow. And so the fair has steadily grown since then. But the 50s were definitely a huge catalyst towards the Iowa State Fair's growth to where it is today.
And at the time, when people, have you seen a change in how families have come to the fair? I know stories from our family where mom packed a picnic lunch. We all went to the fair. There was fried chicken in the car, and yet I know there were wonderful church food stands at the state fair. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's interesting. No one died of salmonella, from that potato salad and that fried chicken in the trunk of the car all day long, right?
Yeah, probably no ice either.
Yeah, we never think about doing that today, but yeah, no, but you are exactly right. The family tradition has changed. People would bring their lunches to the fair, would bring food with them, go to the parking lot, set out a blanket, kind of have a picnic lunch. Now families still come to the fair and eat, but they're doing it with food that they purchase, through all of our food concessions. 1950s, a church row, as it was called, was a row of food stands, all by local churches. At the Iowa State Fair, we've still been able to hold on to one of those. The West Des Moines Methodist Church still has their church stand and is well renowned for their pie, of course, here at the Iowa State Fair. But so those habits have changed. But yet, when you really think about the fair, and again, as I mentioned a little bit ago, this combination of the tradition of looking at livestock and looking at the quilts and going through the varied industries building and picking up, all the little freebies from the businesses, the magnets and the rulers, enjoying the entertainment in the grandstand, enjoying all the different things at the fair really has really changed very little, since the 1950s, which is what makes the fair unique.
At one time for a special event, I can recall having seen this in the history of the State Fair, but there were two locomotives that were coming at each other. Tell us about that. And when?
Well, that was before the 1950s. Actually, the Iowa State Fair did locomotive crashes 4 times. The last one was in 1932, and it was huge grandstand entertainment. In fact, reports show that in 1932, nearly 40,000 people crowded into the Iowa State Fair grandstand, which, by the way, is the same grandstand we use today, and we can only fit like 15,000 people in there. So the fire marshal must have been, looking the other way that day. Of course, he really had to have been with 2 locomotives crashing together. But literally, in front of the Iowa State Fair grandstand, a railroad track was laid, 2 locomotives pulling one car each. That car was full of wood and also had been doused in kerosene so it would burn. And literally the 2 trains, one was named the Hoover and one was named the Roosevelt, the 2 presidential candidates in 1932, and just crashed together in front of, you could imagine the noise, the pieces of metal flying through the air. A fascinating attraction at that 1932 fair that kind of continued, not necessarily with the train crashes, but continued on with kind of these big review shows in front of the grandstand. And that gets us to something that happened in 1959. Roy Rogers appeared on the grandstand stage at the Iowa State Fair and was the first time really a famous musician, a famous musical artist performed. And that really started what we still do today, which are nightly concerts in our grandstand with famous celebrity singers. So
did he have Trigger with him?
That I don't know. But he appeared in the grandstand in 1959, which again was the start of really concerts at the fair.
I have a question back there with those locomotives. Were there humans in the engines?
No.
How do they do that then?
My understanding, literally from what I've read, is they started those trains and then those guys bailed out. So. Ooh. But there were reports of, fairgoers getting injured, as you can imagine, getting injured with pieces of, flying shrapnel type of a thing, for sure.
Yeah. So, every fair has a carnival. What was a carnival like back then in the mid 20th century?
Yeah, 1950s, our carnival provider at that time was the Royal American Shows here at the Iowa State Fair. And carnivals at that time traveled by train. They would travel from town to town, community to community by train, of course, and unload the rides, and then they would be hauled to the fairgrounds. And so similar to what you would see today in terms of carnival rides, obviously, old standbys like Ferris wheels, carousels, rides like that were around and still part of the thrill shows. Now, 1950s still would have had some things that we don't have in the carnival today. While while we think of society maybe changing, in the 1950s, you still could catch girly shows on the Midway, little tents where you could go in and see some ladies dancing. We no longer have that at the fair, but games, of course, and all those types of things. Again, just some pretty similarities for sure.
And how did the girly shows stop? Were there complaints or what happened?
I would say probably there were complaints, and probably when you think back to probably the risque-ness of the girly show in the 1950s, probably wasn't nearly as bad as what we think it would be compared to what we see today. But again, that's been part of the Iowa State Fair for a long time. It's interesting when you study fair history way back prior to the 1950s, into the 1800s, this huge fight between people who thought fairs needed to just be these educational events of agriculture and farmers getting together versus the people that wanted to come to the fair and have a good time. And of course, fairs soon realized we had to do all the stuff to have a good time to help pay the bills to do the agricultural part of it. So obviously, it's always been an interesting challenge in the fair world since then.
Yeah. Okay, I would like to know, when this is a big job of planning, and you start a year or 2 years ahead, or how, in order specifically to get at the grandstand every night there's a something or other for 10 days. Okay.
Yeah.
When does that begin? And do you have a committee? Or what?
That's a great question. So we're fortunate here at the Iowa State Fair. We have a large full-time staff that plan the fair, each year, and we have a board that we report to. But ultimately, we have staff members who make those decisions on entertainment and different things like that. We truly start planning the next year's fair as soon as the fair is over. The fair ends in August. We take a couple weeks to regroup. But then we start early in September right away with planning for 2024. Now, the grandstand concert piece, that is really closer to 18 months out. In fact, I had most of the 2024 grandstand acts booked during this last fair. So I will start pretty quick after the first of the year, already starting on 2025.
Okay.
Jeremy, going back to the livestock, that most people thought livestock was certainly necessarily for the well-being of the fair. In the 50s, of course, there really weren't livestock trailers. How did livestock get to the fair? Was it by rail? Was it by little trucks? How did that happen?
You've hit both of those right on the head. One, it was by rail. In fact, many fairs worked together to secure cheaper railroad rates so that their livestock exhibitors could travel from fair to fair. So rail was a part, but then also, as you just mentioned, in the back of trucks, livestock came. Obviously, livestock was a little smaller than it is today, and so you saw a lot of livestock. In fact, that's a memory my mom will tell you of camping at the Iowa State Fair. They would bring the animals to the fair, drop them off at the barn, then take that truck with the stock rack in the back of it up to the campgrounds, put a tarp over the top, and that's where they slept and camped. So she has great memories of that. And then, of course, when it was time to leave the fair, you'd go back and load up your animals and go back home.
Yes. Well, at the time, too, there was did livestock travel on a fair circuit? They would go to the Iowa State Fair and then, Wisconsin? Or...
Actually, for us, they would come from, and really the circuit is still in place, especially for many of our draft horse exhibitors. They still follow that circuit. But you're correct. It starts with Wisconsin in early August, then the Iowa State Fair in mid-August, and then the Minnesota State Fair, which ends on Labor Day. So especially for our draft horse exhibitors, they still follow that circuit quite closely.
Okay. And do they use trains, or do they have their only trailers, maybe, huh?
Yeah, no livestock traveling by train today. It's really nice livestock trailers, and you're right, for those draft horses, they're coming in semis for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you have a highlight of a particular fair for you?
That's a good question. I think I mean, sometimes highlights are good and bad. I know back in 2020 when I was still at the Clay County Fair in Spencer, a sad highlight was announcing we were not going to have a fair, due to COVID. So that's kind of a sad highlight. But, really for me, knowing that I'm at an institution like the Iowa State Fair that's been around for 170 years and families still come and have a good time, that's really special when you see families enjoying themselves at the fair, and they're making a memory that when that child is 50 or 60 years old, they're going to think back and remember that day at the fair. And knowing that myself and our staff and our board and all of our volunteers helped make that happen, that's a highlight every day for sure at the fair.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So what is the most challenging part of being a CEO and manager of this renowned Iowa State Fair?
I think part of it is keeping up the tradition. Obviously, people have a high expectation of what the Iowa State Fair should be, and so we want to keep that tradition alive. That's a challenge, but I touched on it earlier. It's really just keeping people safe. We want families to come to the fair, have a good time, and not have to worry about their safety. And again, you watch much of the news today, which I don't always recommend you do, but there's a lot of bad things that happen in the world, and we just want to make sure we keep everybody safe when they're here at the fair.
Mm-hmm. Do you have metal detectors at the main gate?
We do. Yep. All of our fairgoers, when they enter the fairgrounds, you come through metal detectors. We have lots of cameras operating on the grounds as well. Just to keep, while we'd love to think that everybody comes to the Iowa State Fair just to have a great time with their family, there's always a few rotten apples that are here to disrupt that good time.
Society.
Well,
yep.
And of course, there are numerous gates in which people could enter.
Mm-hmm.
Has that changed through the years, and how many gates are available for people through which people can enter just because of safety?
Yeah, definitely. Back to what the Iowa State Fair was like in the 1950s. The main thoroughfare through the Iowa State Fairgrounds is called the Grand Concourse, and it's just a big wide street with food stands on either side. And when you would have come to the fair in the 1950s, you could have driven your car on that Grand Concourse and parked, and then went and enjoyed the fair. And obviously, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, that changed as that street became closed off, and now it's just a really wide sidewalk. But yeah, those are some changes that the fair made for sure, just to keep people safe. Again, just to continue that process of keeping people safe.
Yes.
Okay.
The buildings there are certainly renowned historically. How do you keep them in looking good?
It's a lot of hard work. We're fortunate here at the Iowa State Fair to have the Blue Ribbon Foundation on our side, and the Blue Ribbon Foundation is our fundraising arm, I guess you could say, and they've done a spectacular job raising money to preserve and restore the Iowa State Fairgrounds, and also make those buildings good for the next 100 years. Back to changes in society, boy, people sure like air conditioning today. They maybe didn't have it as much in the 1950s as we do today. So we try to air condition our buildings, but still maintain their historic image. And yeah, if you Google Iowa State Fair and look at some of our beautiful buildings, you'll see that these great brick buildings, beautiful 2-story, just huge buildings, still preserved and still enjoyed by Iowans when they come to the fair.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so speaking of changes, I have been to the Iowa State Fair, and I noticed that there's a lot of asphalt there. At the beginning, it was probably pretty dusty. When did this change?
That's a great question. I think what's interesting is people have, when they go places, they really have higher expectations of what it needs to be, and people don't like to wander around in the mud. And I already mentioned the air conditioning and yeah, paving's been a big process at the fair over the last 30 years, especially as we've again, really as the fairgrounds has become used more year round. That really has been the driving factor on a lot of it. We host a lot of events here throughout the year. An event reminding me of the 1950s, we hold a Good Guys car show here, which is the classic car show over 4th of July weekend. We hold a lot of events here, and obviously when you use the buildings or the grounds more, they need to be in better shape. So the buildings need to be nicer, the restrooms need to be nicer. a lot more hard surface, concrete and asphalt for people to walk on. And so that's really been something that's occurred really pretty steadily over the last 20 to 30 years.
Okay. And then because you rent out these areas, that then helps pay the bills for the maintenance, I suppose.
It really does. When you think about a fair, you think, if I would go to a banker and say, I'm going to have an event for 11 days out of the year outside, and it's going to generate all my income to operate on for a year, most bankers would probably laugh you, out the door. And so it's kind of that way here with us with the fair. When we can hold these non-fair events, they help generate money in case maybe the fair is not great from a weather perspective. But it also helps us just use the facilities more. And you need to invest more in those facilities the more you use them.
Yeah. So diversify.
That's exactly right. The fair is like a business like everything else. Yeah. How many different revenue streams can we try to figure out? For sure.
Jeremy, as a annual goer to and having been exhibitor at the Iowa State Fair, through the years, we've seen different standards of dress, what people wear to the fair. So do you know what, back in the 1950s, how a fairgoer might have dressed?
Well, I will go back. I'll start a little back further than that. We've seen some beautiful photos. And again, you're familiar with the Ag Building here at the Iowa State Fair, home of the butter cow. And I was just looking at some photos the other day from the early 1900s. And there's, women in long dresses and long sleeves and hats and men in suits. And we don't dress that way anymore when we come to the fair. In fact, you sometimes wonder why people got out of their house dressed the way they did. But my guess is in the 1950s, you probably had a combination of some of those things. You probably had some kids, dressed in the clothing of the day, but probably some of the older generation still probably really dressed up at the fair. I think probably the 50s were probably an interesting transition at that time where some of the older generations still dressing up as opposed to today when people maybe dress a little more similarly, just in terms, I guess, of jeans is what I'm thinking of more than anything, but or shorts. But my guess is the 50s probably were an interesting transition time in fashion at the fair.
What were some of the fair foods that were popular in the 50s, and then how the transition occurred to favorite fair foods of today?
Yeah, you think back to the 1950s, a lot of the food stands would be what I would consider some pretty normal restaurant food. Those restaurants that the churches were operating, probably lots of sandwiches, hamburgers, hot dogs. We know the Wonder Bar was around in the 1950s at the Iowa State Fair, which of course.
What's a Wonder Bar?
Oh, it's an ice cream bar dipped in chocolate, then rolled in peanuts. So I'm sure Wonder Bars were around at the time. And also in the 1950s, though, you were starting to see some transition away from kind of what I would call sit-down restaurant food to the introduction of the corn dog, for example, or poncho dogs, as they were called back then. But now today, it's kind of the more bizarre, the more unique, the better at the fair. People really gravitate towards some interesting things, not only at the Iowa State Fair, but at a lot of fairs. One of the best new foods at last year's Iowa State Fair was a grilled cheese sandwich with brisket and mac and cheese on it. So it was a brisket, mac and cheese, grilled cheese, which was phenomenal, by the way.
Yeah.
I had that.
Sounds like a meal.
Yeah, it was a meal. It was a meal in itself. And obviously with diversity, you're seeing a lot more different ethnic foods at the fair as well. This year, one of the food vendors outside of the livestock pavilion, again, you think of the livestock pavilion, beautiful brick building built in the early 1900s, but one of the food vendors there had Vietnamese food, and it was some people that had immigrated from Vietnam. And so always change at the fair, especially with food. But I think you don't see very many people bringing their own lunches anymore, as you were talking about with fried chicken. You're seeing people enjoying food at the fair.
How did the movie State Fair have a connection with the Iowa State Fair?
Well, the connection really was the book that the movie is based on. So there is a novel called State Fair that was written by Phil Stong, who was an Iowan. And that novel then was turned into, was it 2 or 3 motion pictures, I believe, and then also a Broadway musical as well. But it was a book written about the Iowa State Fair by an Iowan. That book was written in the 1930s. I think the first the first movie version of State Fair may have come out in the late 1940s, but then there was another that came out in the 1950s as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great story.
Oh, a great story. Love at the Iowa State Fair.
Yeah.
Kind of that combination between city and rural, for sure.
Yes.
And music.
That's right. Our state fair is a great state fair. Don't miss
Yes.
it. Don't even be late. It's dollars to donuts at our state fair. It's the best state fair in our state. That's right.
Yeah, and even in the world,
Right.
in the world. The Iowa State Fair has a museum.
Mhm.
Tell us about that museum and how it captures the essence of the story of the Iowa State Fair.
Well, appropriately, it's located in one of our more historic buildings on the fairgrounds up by Pioneer Hall, which Pioneer Hall was built in 1886 for the first Iowa State Fair. But right next to it is the State Fair Museum that really captures the entire history of the Iowa State Fair. When you really think about it, the history of the Iowa State Fair really is the history of Iowa. And all the things that have happened in our state that have also affected the fair. And so the museum is a great place to look at some great old photos, to see the fairgrounds, how it looked back in those days in the 1950s and before. A great place to see old advertising artifacts, old fair posters. They even run some highlights sometimes of old fair television and radio commercials. And again, it's just about reminding people of that tradition. And, again, everybody's got a story. Maybe it was that first kiss on the old mill, or maybe it was some other memory they have at the fair. But the museum does a great job capturing that. And we, from time to time, will have people stop in our offices year round and drop off items for that museum, things that they found in maybe their own home or maybe their parents' home or grandparents' home. And we always love to see all those great artifacts.
Jeremy, in all your years of attending the Iowa State Fair or being a fair goer or a fair manager, did you ever have it in your heart to be the executive CEO of the Iowa State Fair?
Well, I knew growing up that would be a pretty fun job. And in fact, I have to say there was a project I did in elementary school. I grew up again in Leon, and we had a project where we had to talk about a future job we'd like to have. What do you want to be when you grow up? And so I thought working at the fair would be great. I didn't know what that meant, but I remember that being part of the project. And it really is a childhood dream come true to be here at the Iowa State Fair for sure.
That is so neat.
So do you have,
go ahead.
have any members of your family exhibited at the fair?
I've had lots of members of my family exhibit at the fair, lots of cousins, lots of people been involved in the fair many different ways.
I'm thinking about 4-Hers and FFA exhibitors. When they would come to the fair, would their parents drop them off? Would they leave them for the time? Where did they sleep? How did that all work out?
Well, this is interesting. A great tie to the 1950s, actually. So the Iowa State Fair was experiencing a lot of growth in 4-H and FFA kids wanting to show at the fair. So in 1950, actually, a girls' dormitory was built. For those of you that are watching, you all might be familiar with the Cultural Center now at the Iowa State Fair. But when it was first built in 1950, it was actually a girls' dorm, and it was a companion piece to the youth inn at the bottom of the hill, of that big hill there on the fairgrounds, where all the boys stayed. Although those numbers have shrunk, we still have several hundred 4-H and FFA students stay at the fair during the fair, showing livestock or maybe being grandstand ushers. So they still stay in youth inn. We still feed them there's still a cafeteria in there that feeds them their food. But for many people, their fair experience is staying in the dorm. And that's gone back for sure since the 1950s, and actually a little bit before that.
Did each group have to have a chaperone if you were coming from the county?
I would have to double check that. My guess is yes. Now we provide chaperones in those dorm room spaces, but chaperones are provided. So those kids so the parents can feel good that their kids are safe while they're at the fair.
Yes, yes. Viewers, we've had just an exciting run through of the beginning and the past and the future and where we are now today with the Iowa State Fair with the executive director, Jeremy Parsons, you have to be a fair lover in order to have that job.
You have to, and yes, we work year round. My mother-in-law sometimes doesn't understand what I do this time of year, but I promise I'm hard at work getting the next fair ready. So
okay, and we'd love to know in the comments, viewers, if you've been to the Iowa State Fair, please let us know. And if there's anything really special on your heart about the Iowa State Fair, we are blessed in Iowa to have that state fair. Jeremy, this has been wonderful to get the lowdown from you. Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. We appreciate your time. We know you're busy. Thank you.
Yeah, even if it's not fair time right now. Jackie, how can you close our show today?
Just a very short reminder for viewers to look at the red subscribe button and touch that, as well as the blue thumbs up button. We would appreciate having that. And so until next time, tell your friends, even your relatives, about the 1950s Fun Chat. Until then, toodaloo.